Arrogance is a deadly blindfold. Officer Brody Higgins smirked as the gavel fell, certain his meticulously rehearsed lies had just buried another innocent black man. He believed he was an untouchable predator, cornering a helpless victim in a rigged system. He had no idea he was actually the prey. The night of October 14th was bitterly cold, the kind of autumn evening that drove most sensible people indoors and left the sprawling asphalt of Route 9 South desolate. Isaiah Caldwell was driving his understated 2018 blue sedan, keeping his speed exactly 2 miles under the legal limit. He was a man of precise habits, dressed in a muted gray sweater, his eyes scanning the road with a quiet, practiced intensity. The clock on the dashboard glowed 11:45 p.m. Suddenly, the darkness in his rearview mirror was violently shattered by the strobe of red and blue lights. Isaiah didn't panic. He sighed, a slow, deliberate exhalation that carried the weight of 1,000 similar nights, and pulled the sedan safely onto the gravel shoulder. He turned off the engine, rolled down the window, and placed both hands firmly on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. The protocol was second nature to him, ingrained through years of navigating a world that often saw his skin color before it saw his humanity. Footsteps crunched on the gravel, heavy, deliberate, intimidating. 2 silhouettes emerged from the glare of the cruiser's headlights. Officer Brody Higgins approached the driver's side, his hand resting casually but conspicuously on the butt of his service weapon. Higgins was a heavily built man with a buzz cut and a reputation in the 42nd Precinct for producing results, regardless of the methods. Flanking the passenger side was Sergeant Miller Davies, a 15-year veteran whose cynical smirk was practically a permanent fixture on his weathered face. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Higgins barked, leaning in close enough that Isaiah could smell the stale black coffee and wintergreen chewing tobacco on his breath. There was no good evening, no explanation for the stop, just a sharp, commanding demand designed to establish dominance. "Of course, officer," Isaiah replied. His voice was steady, perfectly modulated. "My wallet is in my back right pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I am going to reach for them now." Higgins narrowed his eyes, clearly unaccustomed to such clinical calm. Most people were nervous, stammering, easily tripped up. Just get 'em, and make it quick. Isaiah handed over the documents. Higgins snatched them, shining his heavy tactical flashlight directly into Isaiah's eyes, lingering just long enough to be painful. "You know why I pulled you over, boy?" Isaiah didn't flinch at the deliberate disrespect. He kept his eyes focused forward. "I assume you are going to tell me, officer." "Don't get smart with me," Higgins snapped, tapping the roof of the car hard. "Your passenger side tail light is out. That's a hazard." Isaiah knew his car was meticulously maintained. He had checked all the lights just 3 days prior. Before he could respond, a sharp, hollow crack echoed from the rear passenger side of the vehicle. Isaiah glanced in the rearview mirror. Sergeant Davies was standing by the trunk, casually lowering his heavy metal flashlight. "Yep, completely shattered," Davies called out, his voice dripping with faux innocence. "Looks like a recent break, too. Glass all over the bumper." Isaiah's jaw tightened, but his hands remained flat on the wheel. "I see. Step out of the vehicle," Higgins ordered, yanking the door handle. "Is that a lawful order, officer, for a broken tail light?" Isaiah asked, his tone still perfectly even. "I said step out of the damn car," Higgins roared, his temper flaring at the slightest hint of defiance. He grabbed Isaiah by the collar of his sweater and hauled him violently out of the driver's seat. Isaiah offered no physical resistance, letting his body go limp to avoid giving them any excuse. But Higgins wasn't looking for an excuse. He was manufacturing one. With a sudden, brutal shove, Higgins slammed Isaiah face first onto the cold hood of the sedan. The metal bit into Isaiah's cheek. "Stop resisting! Stop reaching for my belt!" Higgins yelled at the top of his lungs. Isaiah's hands were splayed wide on the hood, completely visible. "I am not resisting," Isaiah said loudly, ensuring his voice carried over the wind. "My hands are on the hood. Davies rushed over, grabbing Isaiah's left arm and wrenching it painfully behind his back. "He's fighting, Brody! Take him down!" A swift kick to the back of Isaiah's knees sent him crashing to the gravel. The heavy weight of a knee drove into his spine, forcing the air from his lungs. Cold steel cuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting into the skin. "We got a live one tonight," Davies chuckled, patting Isaiah down aggressively. "Assaulting a police officer, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct. You're going away for a while, tough guy." Isaiah lay in the dirt, the taste of blood in his mouth from where he had bitten his tongue. He didn't scream, he didn't beg. He just stared at the shiny black boots of the officers, memorizing the serial numbers on their badges, the time on Higgins' watch, the exact phrasing of their manufactured panic. Back at the 42nd Precinct, the booking process was a theater of humiliation. Officer Timothy Jenkins, the desk sergeant, barely looked up from his paperwork as Higgins and Davies hauled a bruised Isaiah to the counter. "What do we have, boys?" Jenkins asked lazily. "Traffic stop gone bad, Timmy," Higgins said, leaning against the counter and rubbing a supposedly injured shoulder. "Suspect became combative, tried to grab my sidearm, had to use necessary force to subdue." "Shame," Jenkins muttered, stamping a file. "Name?" "Isaiah Caldwell," Isaiah said quietly. They stripped him of his shoelaces, his belt, his wallet, and his dignity, tossing him into a holding cell that smelled of bleach and despair. When offered his one phone call, Isaiah declined. "You sure, buddy?" Davies sneered through the bars. "You're gonna need a miracle worker, not just a public defender." "I don't need to make a call," Isaiah said, sitting on the steel bench, his posture perfectly straight, despite the pain radiating from his ribs. "I will be representing myself." Higgins and Davies walked away laughing. They felt untouchable. They had done this a dozen times before to men just like Isaiah, men without means, without connections, men whose words would never outweigh the sworn testimony of two decorated officers. Just last year, a kid named Sage Pendleton had tried to fight them in court over a similar setup. Pendleton was currently serving 3 years upstate. They assumed Isaiah Caldwell was just another statistic, another body to feed the prison machine and pad their arrest quotas. They had no idea they had just kicked open the gates of hell. 6 weeks later, the air inside Courtroom 304 of the county courthouse was stagnant, thick with the smell of floor wax and the oppressive weight of bureaucracy. Judge Harold Sterling sat perched behind the towering mahogany bench, looking bored and impatient. Sterling was a conservative hardliner, a former prosecutor known for rubber-stamping police testimony and handing down maximum sentences to those who dared challenge the badge. At the prosecution's table sat Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Trent. Trent was sharp, ambitious, and aggressively climbing the political ladder. She viewed the Caldwell case as a simple, open-and-shut assault trial, an easy win to boost her conviction rate before the upcoming election cycle. Across the aisle, sitting entirely alone at the defense table, was Isaiah Caldwell. He wore a sharp, impeccably tailored navy blue suit that stood in stark contrast to the rumpled clothes he had been arrested in. He sat with perfect posture, his legal pads aligned symmetrically, a trio of pens laid out in front of him. He looked less like a desperate defendant and more like a corporate CEO waiting for a board meeting to commence. In the gallery behind the prosecution, Officer Higgins and Sergeant Davies sat in their dress blues, their chests adorned with commendations. They nudged each other, whispering and smirking, waiting for the slaughter to begin. "The state calls Officer Brody Higgins," ADA Trent announced, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. Higgins strode to the witness stand with practiced confidence. He placed his left hand on the Bible, swore to tell the whole truth, and settled into the leather chair, adjusting his microphone. Trent walked him through the events of October 14th. With polished ease, Higgins spun his fictional narrative. He described a routine traffic stop for a shattered taillight. He described a hostile, aggressive defendant who refused to comply with lawful orders. "Can you describe what happened when you asked Mr. Caldwell to step out of the vehicle?" Officer Higgins? Trent asked, leaning against the jury box. Higgins put on a mask of grave professionalism. The defendant became highly agitated. He lunged at me, striking me in the chest and attempting to unholster my service weapon. I feared for my life and the life of my partner. We had to utilize physical compliance holds to neutralize the immediate threat. And did your body camera capture this terrifying assault, officer? Higgins shook his head, looking suitably regretful. Unfortunately, no. As is detailed in my report, there was a technical malfunction with my Axon unit that evening. It failed to record the 2 minutes immediately prior to and during the physical altercation. Sergeant Davies' camera experienced a similar battery failure. A convenient coincidence for the defendant, Trent noted sympathetically. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Sterling peered over his reading glasses at the defense table. Mr. Caldwell, as you are proceeding pro se, you have the right to cross-examine. I advise you to keep it brief and relevant. I will not tolerate grandstanding. Isaiah stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't carry any notes. He walked toward the center of the room, stopping exactly on the seal of the state etched into the floor. He looked at Higgins, not with anger, but with the cold, dissecting gaze of a biologist examining a dangerous microbe under a slide. Officer Higgins, Isaiah began, his voice resonant and commanding, entirely different from the quiet man on the side of the highway. You testified under oath that my passenger side taillight was shattered prior to you pulling me over. Is that correct? Yes, Higgins stated firmly. You are certain of this? It was not, for instance, struck by Sergeant Davies' flashlight after I was stopped. Higgins scoffed loudly. Ada Trent stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative and speculative. Sustained, Judge Sterling grumbled. Mr. Caldwell, do not badger the witness. Apologies, Your Honor, Isaiah said smoothly. He turned back to Higgins. Officer, you also testified that I struck you in the chest and attempted to take your firearm, a felony assault. That's right. And you are absolutely certain that your body camera suffered a malfunction during this exact window of time, a glitch that cannot be recovered by the police department's IT forensics team? I am completely certain, Higgins said, a smug smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He knew the department IT guys always covered for them. The footage was permanently deleted. Thank you, officer. No further questions for this witness. Higgins stepped down, looking victorious. Ada Trent then called Sergeant Miller Davies to the stand. Davies corroborated every single lie Higgins had told, locking them both firmly into a synchronized perjury. He described Isaiah's wild eyes and violent swinging. He confirmed the simultaneous, tragic failure of both their body cameras. When it was Isaiah's turn to cross-examine Davies, he asked only 3 questions. Sergeant Davies, you witnessed me assault Officer Higgins? I did. You are under oath, stating that I instigated a physical, unprovoked attack against 2 armed police officers? Yes, I am. And you are absolutely positive that there is no video or audio evidence of this interaction existing anywhere in the world? Davies grinned, leaning forward into the microphone. I am positive, Mr. Caldwell. It's just your word against ours. The gallery remained silent, but the absolute arrogance of the police officers hung thick in the air. Judge Sterling sighed, looking at the wall clock. Does the defense have any witnesses to call, Mr. Caldwell? Or are we ready for closing arguments so I can render a verdict? Sterling asked dismissively. It was a bench trial, meaning Sterling alone would decide Isaiah's fate. The verdict was practically pre-written. Isaiah walked back to his table and picked up his leather briefcase. He didn't open it immediately. He stood there, letting the silence stretch, letting the smugness of Higgins and Davies reach its absolute peak. Your Honor, Isaiah finally spoke, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a chilling authority that made Ada Trent sit up straight. The defense does not wish to call any witnesses. The defense wishes to enter a single piece of evidence into the record. Defense Exhibit A. Isaiah popped the brass latches of his briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a small, sleek, black rectangular device, holding it up by his fingertips. It wasn't a phone. It was a piece of high-end, encrypted digital hardware. "Objection!" Ada Trent barked, standing up quickly. "We have not been provided with this evidence in discovery, Your Honor. This is an ambush." "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Sterling said, his brow furrowing in irritation, "you cannot introduce surprise evidence at the end of a trial." "What is that?" Isaiah didn't look at the judge. He looked directly at Officer Brody Higgins, whose smug smile had suddenly faltered. "This, Your Honor," Isaiah said, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying clarity, "is the encrypted hard drive from the discrete 360-degree audio-visual dash and cabin recording system hardwired into my vehicle. A system that bypasses local storage and streams directly to a secure federal server." The courtroom went dead silent. A pin dropping would have sounded like a bomb. "And furthermore, Your Honor," Isaiah continued, reaching into his breast pocket and pulling out a heavy, gold badge enclosed in a leather credential case, flipping it open for the judge to see. "I would like to correct the record regarding my employment, which the prosecution failed to adequately research. I am not an unemployed civilian. My name is Isaiah Caldwell. I am the Deputy Chief Inspector General for the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division." Officer Higgins physically slumped in his chair. Sergeant Davies turned the color of wet ash. Isaiah placed the badge on the table. "And for the last 18 months, I have been running an undercover federal probe into the systematic corruption, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations perpetrated by the 42nd Precinct. You didn't catch a suspect on Route 9, Officer Higgins. You walked blindly into a federal trap." The silence in courtroom 304 was absolute, thick, and suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a catastrophic implosion. Judge Harold Sterling's gavel remained suspended in mid-air, his hand trembling slightly. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Trent looked as though the floor beneath her sensible heels had suddenly turned into quicksand. She stared at the gold badge resting on the defense table, the eagle emblem glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights, and felt her entire political future dissolving into vapor. Officer Brody Higgins was practically hyperventilating. His massive chest heaved beneath his tailored dress uniform, the brass buttons suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. Beside him, Sergeant Miller Davies had gone completely rigid, his cynical smirk replaced by the hollow, empty stare of a man who had just watched his own execution order being signed. "Deputy, Chief Inspector General," Judge Sterling finally managed to stammer, his usually booming voice reduced to a dry rasp. The conservative hardliner, known for his unquestioning loyalty to the badge, suddenly realized he was sitting in the crosshairs of the United States Department of Justice. Isaiah Caldwell did not smile. He did not gloat. He remained the picture of absolute, terrifying composure. "That is correct, Your Honor. For the past 18 months, my office, in conjunction with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit, has been conducting Operation Blind Justice. We have been investigating a systemic pattern of civil rights violations, evidence tampering, perjury, and excessive force originating specifically from the 42nd Precinct." Isaiah turned his gaze toward the prosecution table. Ada Trent physically recoiled. "Your Honor," Isaiah continued, his voice ringing with the authority of the federal government, "I am submitting this drive not merely as defense evidence to clear my own name, but as Exhibit A in a sweeping federal indictment. I request the court's permission to play the encrypted audiovisual file on the courtroom monitors. I believe it will immediately clarify the events of October 14th. Sterling swallowed hard. "Granted," he squeaked. Isaiah retrieved a high-speed encrypted cable from his briefcase, plugged the drive into the court's presentation system, and typed in a complex 3-2 character decryption sequence. The large flat-screen monitors mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life. What the court saw was not shaky, grainy police footage. It was a pristine 4K resolution 360-degree composite video recorded from 4 discreetly housed micro cameras, seamlessly integrated into the chassis of Isaiah's sedan. The heads-up display on the footage showed the exact GPS coordinates, the vehicle's speed, the RPMs, and the precise time down to the millisecond. The video began playing. The courtroom watched from the perspective of the sedan's trunk camera as Higgins' cruiser initiated the stop. They saw Isaiah pull over smoothly. Then came the audio. It was crystal clear, captured by military-grade parabolic microphones hidden in the sedan's side mirrors. License, registration, and proof of insurance, Higgins' voice boomed from the courtroom speakers, sounding hostile and belligerent. They heard Isaiah's calm, compliant response. They watched as Higgins deliberately shined his tactical flashlight into Isaiah's eyes. And then came the moment that destroyed everything. On the screen, the camera angle switched to the rear passenger side. The entire courtroom watched in high definition as Sergeant Miller Davies casually walked up to the perfectly intact taillight. They watched him raise his heavy, solid steel maglite. Crack! The sound of the plastic shattering echoed through the silent courtroom like a thunderclap. "Yep," completely shattered, Davies' recorded voice drawled sarcastically. "Looks like a recent break, too. Glass all over the bumper." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Ada Trent buried her face in her hands. She had aggressively prosecuted a case built entirely on fabricated evidence. Judge Sterling's face turned a mottled, furious purple. He had been used. The video continued. It showed Higgins dragging a completely passive Isaiah from the car. It showed the brutal, unprovoked shove that slammed Isaiah's face into the hood. It showed Davies kicking Isaiah's legs out from under him, driving a knee into a spine that was offering zero resistance. "Stop resisting. Stop reaching for my belt." Higgins was heard screaming on the video, despite the clear, undeniable visual evidence that Isaiah's hands were pinned flat against the hood of the car, nowhere near the officer's waist. The video concluded with the 2 officers laughing over Isaiah's prone, handcuffed body. "You're gonna need a miracle worker, not just a public defender," Davies had sneered. Isaiah paused the video on the exact frame of Davies' laughing face. He turned to the witness stand, where Sergeant Davies was currently sitting. "I didn't need a miracle worker, Sergeant Davies," Isaiah said softly, the silence amplifying his words. "I just needed a hard drive." Before Davies could even attempt to formulate a lie, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding crash. The rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots filled the aisle. 12 men and women wearing dark suits and tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI marched into the room. Leading them was Special Agent in Charge William Ford, a towering, no-nonsense veteran of the Bureau. Agent Ford bypassed the gallery, walked straight past the prosecution table, and stopped directly in front of the witness stand. He looked at Sergeant Davies, then over at Officer Higgins in the gallery. "Brody Higgins." Miller Davies, Agent Ford announced, his voice carrying the inescapable weight of federal law. "You are both under arrest. The charges include Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, and Section 1621, perjury. Furthermore, you are facing federal conspiracy charges for the systemic fabrication of evidence." Higgins tried to stand up, his hands shaking violently. "This is a setup. You can't do this. We're cops. We have union representation." "You were cops," Agent Ford corrected coldly, pulling a pair of heavy federal handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Higgins hesitated, his eyes darting toward the exits. For a brief, insane second, he considered fighting his way out. But he looked at the 12 heavily armed federal agents surrounding him, and then he looked at Isaiah Caldwell, who was packing his pens back into his briefcase with methodical precision. The predator had finally realized he was trapped in a cage of his own making. Trembling, Higgins turned around. The metallic click-clack of the handcuffs, ratcheting tightly around his wrists, sounded exactly like the cuffs he had slapped onto Isaiah 6 weeks prior. Only this time, the metal bit into the flesh of a guilty man. Judge Sterling slammed his gavel down, though it was entirely unnecessary. Case dismissed. With extreme prejudice, Mr. Caldwell. The court extends its deepest apologies to you and the Department of Justice. Isaiah picked up his briefcase, his face remaining a mask of stoic professionalism. Save your apologies for the innocent men your courtroom has wrongfully convicted, Judge Sterling. We will be auditing your sentencing records next. Isaiah walked down the center aisle, the federal agents parting to let him through. He didn't look back at the two corrupt officers being read their Miranda rights. His job here was done. The real work, the utter dismantling of the 42nd Precinct, was just beginning. Karma did not arrive quietly for Brody Higgins and Miller Davies. It came with force, swift, undeniable, and utterly destructive. What they had spent years building through intimidation and corruption collapsed in a matter of days, crushed beneath the weight of truth they could no longer control. The aftermath of the incident in Courtroom 304 sent shockwaves far beyond the city. By late afternoon, the Department of Justice held a nationally televised press conference, formally announcing federal indictments against both officers. But Higgins and Davies were only the beginning. Their downfall triggered something far larger, an unraveling of an entire system built on silence. Armed with damning dashcam footage, the FBI moved quickly. Within hours, they secured a sweeping warrant for the entire 42nd Precinct. At dawn the next day, federal agents descended on the station. Hard drives were seized. Evidence lockers were cataloged. Internal communications were pulled apart piece by piece. Yellow federal tape wrapped around the building, transforming a police precinct into what it had secretly become, a crime scene. The so-called thin blue line shattered almost instantly. Under mounting pressure, Desk Sergeant Timothy Jenkins, once a quiet participant in falsified reports, crumbled. Facing decades in prison, he confessed within minutes of interrogation. In exchange for leniency, he revealed everything. The planted evidence, the off-camera violence, the fabricated overtime schemes, years of misconduct spilled out in a single, devastating account. The consequences were seismic. The district attorney's office, scrambling to preserve credibility, launched an emergency review of past cases. Dozens quickly became hundreds. Within 3 months, more than 80 convictions tied to Higgins and Davies were flagged. One of them was Sage Pendleton, a young man who had once tried and failed to challenge the system that destroyed him. On a cold November morning, Pendleton walked free. Dressed in a borrowed suit, he stepped out of prison into a storm of cameras and flashing lights. His conviction had been overturned. The state, now exposed, prepared to pay millions in restitution. As he embraced his mother outside the gates, the moment became a symbol not just of injustice, but of its long overdue correction. But for Higgins and Davies, there was no redemption. They fought desperately, hiring expensive attorneys funded by a shrinking police union reserve. Their defense strategies were aggressive, challenging evidence, questioning jurisdiction, alleging manipulation. None of it mattered. Federal prosecutors came prepared. They had video proof, forensic analysis, witness testimony, and years of documented patterns. The case was airtight. The trial lasted less than 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. When the verdict came, it was absolute. Guilty on all counts. Higgins broke first, his massive frame trembling as he wept openly in court. Davies remained rigid, his expression hollow, biting down on the last fragments of control he had left. But the outcome was the same for both convictions for civil rights violations, aggravated assault, conspiracy, and perjury. At sentencing, the judge did not hide her contempt. "You were entrusted with power," she said coldly. "Instead, you abused it. You turned the law into a weapon and preyed on those you were sworn to protect. Today that power is gone. 14 years, no parole." The fall was immediate and brutal. Their identities were stripped away, replaced with numbers. Their tailored uniforms were exchanged for coarse prison jumpsuits. As former officers, they could not enter the general population. Instead, they were transferred to a high-security federal penitentiary and placed in isolation for their own protection. Their world shrank to a concrete cell barely large enough to pace. 23 hours a day behind a steel door. Meals passed through a slot, silence broken only by distant echoes of other inmates unraveling in the dark. Time stretched, heavy and unforgiving. Higgins deteriorated quickly. The man who once commanded fear now flinched at the sound of footsteps. He lost weight, sleep, and eventually any illusion of control. He spent his days replaying the moment everything began, the stop, the decision, the arrogance. Davies fared no better. His life outside vanished. His family left. His finances collapsed. Letters stopped coming. He became invisible, buried in a system he once believed he controlled. They had built careers on taking freedom from others. Now, every second of their own lives was dictated by the same system they had abused. 1 year later, Higgins sat alone in his dim cell, staring at his trembling hands. The same hands that had once enforced his authority were now weak, uncertain. Outside, the steady rhythm of guards' boots echoed through the corridor, a sound he once embodied. Now, it belonged to someone else. Slowly, he pulled his knees to his chest and lowered his head. The realization had finally settled in. He had never been untouchable. He had simply been unaware that, all along, he was building the cage that would eventually hold him. True justice is rarely swift, but when it arrives, its weight is absolute. The hunters became the hunted, trapped by the very system they had corrupted for years. In the end, arrogance was their ultimate undoing. The badge they hid behind shattered, leaving them to face the cold, unforgiving reality of a prison cell. Karma does not forget, and it certainly does not forgive those who abuse their sworn power.